A homeless man was led into the courtroom, charged with loitering and causing a public disturbance. He had no lawyer and offered no defense, just sat silently with a distant gaze. The judge flipped through his file, then stopped. Your name is... Her voice caught in her throat. Why would a simple name make an entire courtroom fall silent like a memorial service? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Samuel T. Brooks had become a fixture in downtown Chicago's landscape over the past 15 years. At approximately 75 years old, his tall frame had grown thin with age and circumstance. His white hair long and unkempt beneath a faded military cap that had lost most of its original color. His threadbare army jacket, several sizes too large now, hung from bony shoulders like a relic from another lifetime. Every day, Samuel would position himself on the same bench outside the public library regardless of weather. Unlike other homeless individuals who actively panhandled or created disturbances, Samuel maintained a dignified silence. He never asked for money, never bothered passers-by. Instead, he would sit quietly, occasionally writing in a small tattered notebook with a pencil stub he kept tucked behind his ear. Library staff had grown accustomed to his presence. Some even greeted him with a nod or left coffee nearby on particularly cold mornings. A few noticed he would sometimes open books left on the outdoor return cart, his eyes moving methodically across the pages before carefully returning them to their place. On a Tuesday in late January, a light snow began falling across the city. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, leaving sidewalks slick with ice. Samuel arrived at his usual spot, brushed snow from the bench, and sat down. After a while, perhaps to generate warmth, he began softly singing what sounded like an old military cadence. A new security guard, recently hired by the library, noticed Samuel and became concerned about the unseemly presence deterring patrons. When Samuel's quiet singing continued, the guard called the police, reporting a vagrant creating a disturbance outside the library. 2 officers responded to the call. Officer Jenkins, a rookie with just 6 months on the force, approached cautiously. Sir, we've received complaints about loitering and noise. I'm going to need some identification. Samuel looked up slowly, his weathered face expressionless. He said nothing but reached into his jacket pocket and produced a heavily damaged plastic card, unreadable from years of wear. This isn't valid ID, sir, Jenkins stated. Do you have anything else? Samuel simply shook his head. Sir, you can't stay here. It's against city ordinances to loiter in public spaces. Jenkins continued, growing uncomfortable with Samuel's silence. I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Samuel didn't protest. He carefully closed his notebook, tucked it inside his jacket, and stood without complaint. The officers, expecting resistance, were surprised by his quiet compliance as they escorted him to the patrol car. At the precinct, Samuel was processed like dozens of other homeless individuals that week, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a court date for the following morning. No one asked about his military jacket or the dog tags hidden beneath his layers of clothing. In the overnight holding cell, he sat on a bench against the wall, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. The next morning, the municipal courtroom was crowded with the usual array of minor offenders, public intoxication, shoplifting, traffic violations, and several homeless individuals charged with various nuisance crimes. Samuel was scheduled last on the docket. Judge Evelyn Carter presided with efficient formality. At 61, she had spent over 20 years on the bench, and was known for her no-nonsense approach and even-handed rulings. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her expression perpetually serious behind reading glasses. The courtroom was stuffy and overflowing, with a constant murmur of whispered conversations and shuffling papers. In the gallery, a young legal intern named Maya Delgado observed the proceedings, taking careful notes for her law school practicum. When Samuel's case was called, he didn't respond. The bailiff had to gently tap his shoulder. They're calling you, sir. Samuel rose slowly, his movements stiff from arthritis and the cold night in the holding cell. Several spectators wrinkled their noses as the smell of unwashed clothes wafted through the room. If Samuel noticed their reactions, he gave no indication. Judge Carter picked up the file without looking up. Case number 47-2093, Commonwealth vs. Her voice trailed off as she read the name. When she looked up, her face had drained of color. Your name is Samuel T. Brooks, she asked, her normally steady voice suddenly unsteady. The courtroom fell completely silent. When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains. Want to know what happened next? Judge Evelyn Carter rarely displayed emotion in her courtroom. Over 2 decades on the bench had taught her that maintaining professional detachment was essential to administering justice fairly. But now, staring at the homeless man before her, Something had clearly shaken her composure. "Mr. Brooks," she said after gathering herself, her voice softer than anyone in the regular proceedings had ever heard it. "Did you serve in the military?" Samuel's vacant gaze seemed to focus slightly at the question. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Where did you serve?" Judge Carter pressed, setting aside the case file entirely. "Alpha Company, 17th Special Forces Group, Pleiku Province, Vietnam." Samuel answered mechanically as if reciting information he had been trained never to forget, even as other memories had faded. The courtroom remained uncomfortably silent. The prosecutor, who had been half dozing through what he expected to be routine cases, straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. Judge Carter's hand moved to her robe pocket, withdrawing a small object, wrapped in clear plastic, a medallion of some sort, worn smooth from years of handling. She stared at it momentarily before addressing Samuel again. "Brooks, I was rescued by a soldier from that exact unit when I was a child. He carried me 3 kilometers to safety during a mortar attack. I never knew his name, but I've kept his unit medallion all these years." The court clerk, sensing something significant was unfolding, quickly pulled up additional information on his computer. "Your Honor, our records confirm he is Samuel Lawrence Brooks, Staff Sergeant, honorably discharged in 1983. The young intern, Maya, raised her hand hesitantly. When Judge Carter nodded permission, she stood. "Your Honor, if I may, I accessed the military service database for my pre-law veterans advocacy course. Brooks received both the Silver Star and Purple Heart, the former for leading an extraction of wounded soldiers under heavy fire, and the latter for injuries sustained while shielding fellow soldiers during an ambush." Judge Carter removed her glasses, revealing eyes that had grown unexpectedly moist. "When I was 8 years old, my family was caught in crossfire during a trip to visit relatives, working at a medical outpost near the Vietnamese border. During the chaos, I became separated from my parents. A soldier found me hiding in a drainage ditch, terrified and alone." She paused, visibly collecting herself before continuing. "This soldier carried me through active combat zones until we reached safety. He gave me this medallion and told me to stay brave. 2 days later, my parents found me at a field hospital. I never knew the soldier's name, just that he was from a special forces unit, but I remember his eyes." Judge Carter studied Samuel's face intently. "Those same eyes are looking at me right now." Samuel's expression remained largely unchanged, but something flickered behind his gaze, a momentary connection to a past he could no longer fully access. "Do you remember Cameron Bay, a little girl separated from her family?" the judge asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's brow furrowed with concentration. "Many children. We tried to help them all," he responded vaguely. The police officer who had arrested Samuel shifted uncomfortably. He leaned toward his partner and whispered, "Did we just arrest a war hero?" Maya, the law intern, continued her impromptu research on her tablet. "Your Honor, there's more in his service record. After Vietnam, Mr. Brooks served as a training officer until his discharge. According to Veterans Affairs records, he worked as an interstate bus driver for nearly a decade afterward." "What happened?" Judge Carter asked, directing her question to both Samuel and the court at large. Maya scrolled through more information. "There's a gap in his records after. It appears he was involved in a serious collision when another vehicle struck his bus. He suffered significant head trauma. There are medical notes about memory impairment, particularly short-term recall and ability to manage complex tasks." A court officer who had been standing near the wall, himself a Vietnam veteran, stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may, many vets from that era had their paperwork mixed up in the system. If he couldn't remember details correctly or follow up with the VM, he might have fallen through the cracks, especially with memory issues." Samuel stood silently throughout this discussion of his life, occasionally nodding slightly as if confirming details he could only partially Judge Carter addressed him directly again. "Mr. Brooks, do you have any family we can contact?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "They're gone now," he said simply, offering no elaboration. The prosecutor, recognizing the unusual turn the proceedings had taken. "Your Honor, given these extraordinary circumstances, the Commonwealth would like to request a continuance to reassess the charges." Judge Carter nodded before making an unprecedented announcement. "This court will suspend proceedings against Mr. Brooks immediately. He does not belong in the defendant's chair." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The officer who had arrested Samuel looked down, studying his shoes with sudden interest. Furthermore, Judge Carter continued, "I am personally recusing myself from this case, due to the apparent connection between myself and the defendant." However, before doing so, she stepped down from the bench, something she had never done mid-proceedings in her entire career, and approached Samuel. Standing before him, Judge Carter's small frame seemed suddenly younger, more vulnerable. "I never had the chance to thank you properly," she said, her professional demeanor momentarily set aside. "That medallion you gave me, I carried it through law school, through my first cases, through my appointment to the bench. When cases seemed impossible, I would hold it and remember what real courage looked like." Samuel stared at her, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. His hand moved slowly upward, not quite touching his forehead, but making the suggestion of a salute. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said softly, echoing words he must have said countless times in another life. "No one gets left behind. I don't know about you, but this part really hit me." Type, "respect if it moved you too." Judge Carter immediately called for a 30-minute recess, instructing her clerk, "Contact the Department of Veterans Affairs Emergency Response Team. Tell them we have a priority situation involving a decorated Vietnam veteran, and find me someone from the Veterans Legal Aid Society." Now, as the courtroom emptied, Carter guided Samuel to her chambers personally, an unprecedented breach of protocol that left court officers exchanging bewildered glances. The young intern, Maya, found herself invited along at the judge's request. "You seem to know how to navigate the military databases," Carter explained. "We'll need that." Within her chambers, Judge Carter abandoned all judicial formality. She poured Samuel a cup of coffee, which he held but didn't drink, his hands trembling slightly. "Miss Brooks, I'm going to help you, but I need to understand what happened after your accident," she said gently. "How did a decorated veteran end up homeless?" Samuel's response came slowly, in fragments disconnected by the gaps in his memory. "The headache started, couldn't focus on the road anymore, lost my commercial license. Then the apartment." He gestured vaguely, the chronology clearly jumbled in his mind. Maya, who had been typing rapidly on her tablet, looked up. "I think I found something, Your Honor. According to VA records, Miss Brooks was receiving disability payments until 1997, when they suddenly stopped. There's a note about failure to respond to certification requests and return mail. Recipient unknown. Bureaucratic black hole," Carter muttered. If he couldn't remember to update his address or respond to paperwork, then he would have disappeared from the system. Maya finished. Outside the chambers, word had already begun to spread. A court reporter who had witnessed the unusual proceedings contacted his editor with a potential human interest story. Judge halts trial after recognizing homeless defendant as war hero. Within hours, the story had been picked up by local news outlets. By evening it would reach national attention, with headlines emphasizing the remarkable coincidence. Judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved her life. When court reconvened, the gallery had swelled with reporters and curious onlookers. Judge Carter had changed into a different robe, her ceremonial one, usually reserved for special court sessions. She also had visitors beside her, two representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and a silver-haired man in a precisely tailored suit, who was introduced as Colonel Lucas Brandt, retired, now serving with the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. Before this court proceeds further, Carter announced, "I wish to make a statement for the record. This morning's proceedings have revealed information of significant importance regarding the defendant, Samuel Lawrence Brooks." She gestured to Colonel Brandt, who stood and addressed the courtroom. "After reviewing available records, we can confirm that Staff Sergeant Brooks was indeed part of a classified operation codenamed Rising Fog which involved extraction of American POWs from a facility just across the Laotian border. This operation remained classified until 2008, which means Brooks himself was never able to publicly acknowledge his role." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Carter continued, "Additionally, preliminary investigation confirms that following a traumatic brain injury in Brooks experienced significant memory impairment that likely prevented him from navigating the bureaucratic processes necessary to maintain his benefits and housing." The prosecutor, now fully awake to the significance of the case, stood. "Your Honor, in light of these extraordinary circumstances, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Brooks with prejudice." "So ordered," Carter responded immediately. "But this court will not stop at merely dismissing charges. A grave injustice has been perpetrated, not by any individual, but by a system that failed to recognize and support a man who risked everything in service to his country." The VA representatives approached, carrying a folder of documents. "We've begun emergency reinstatement procedures for Brooks's benefits," one explained. "Back payments will require additional processing time, but we've authorized immediate housing and medical assistance. As these announcements unfolded, the story continued spreading across social media platforms. The hashtag #Honor Brooks began trending nationally, accompanied by posts expressing outrage that a decorated veteran had been reduced to homelessness and facing criminal charges. Veterans groups mobilized with remarkable speed. By mid-afternoon, representatives from 3 different organizations had arrived at the courthouse, each offering assistance with housing, medical care and legal support to restore Brooks's full benefit. A particularly moving moment occurred when a group of active duty service members in Chicago, for training exercises, arrived in full uniform to stand at attention outside the courthouse in a show of respect. Inside, Judge Carter made an unprecedented decision. This court will convene a special recognition session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. While I have officially recused myself from Mr. Brooks's case, I will preside over this special session in my capacity as a private citizen and beneficiary of Mr. Brooks's courage. That evening Samuel was escorted, not to a homeless shelter, but to a private room at the VA Medical Center, where doctors began comprehensive evaluations of his physical and cognitive condition. The initial prognosis was cautiously optimistic. While some memory deficits appeared permanent, specialized therapy might help recover additional fragments of his past and improve his quality of life. Judge Carter, after concluding court business, visited him there, bringing the small medallion that had connected their lives across decades. "Do you remember giving this to me?" she asked, placing it in his palm. Samuel studied it carefully, turning it over several times. "Sometimes things come back in pieces," he said slowly. "A village on fire, a little girl crying under a culvert, so many scared eyes." Carter nodded. "That was me. You told me to be brave. That help was coming. Then you carried me to safety." "Just doing my job," Samuel repeated, the phrase seeming to serve as both a genuine response and a default when memory failed him. "Your job saved my life," Carter replied, "and now perhaps I can help save yours." The following morning, the courthouse witnessed an extraordinary scene. The special session announced by Judge Carter had drawn hundreds of attendees, veterans, active service members, media and ordinary citizens moved by Brooks's story. Carter, not in her judicial robes, but in formal civilian attire, presented Samuel with something he had lost decades ago, a properly documented identity. A team had worked through the night to prepare a complete package: birth certificate, social security card, military ID and Veterans Affairs identification. "Miss Brooks," she said formally, "on behalf of a grateful nation, and a particularly grateful 8-year-old girl, who grew up because of your courage, I return to you your identity and your honor, though the latter you never truly lost." Samuel, now dressed in clean clothes provided by a veterans group, accepted the documents with hands that trembled less than they had the day before. For a brief moment, his military bearing returned, shoulders squared, chin lifted, a flash of the young soldier he had once been visible through the years of hardship. The courthouse then witnessed something even more remarkable. Judge Evelyn Carter removed her judicial robe, stepped down from the bench, and approached Samuel with her hand extended. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, I cannot pass judgment on a man to whom I owe my life." The impact of the special session resonated far beyond the courtroom. By that afternoon, the Chicago City Council had announced an emergency review of protocols for handling homeless veterans in the legal system. The mayor's office issued a directive requiring police to check for military service before processing any homeless individual for minor offenses. The most significant outcome, however, emerged from the Veterans Affairs Department, which announced a new initiative specifically designed to identify and support veterans with cognitive impairments who had fallen through administrative cracks. The program would be named Operation Brooks, in recognition of the man whose story had exposed this critical gap in the system. As Samuel prepared to leave the courthouse, surrounded by his newly formed support network, a reporter called out, "Miss Brooks, how does it feel to be recognized after all these years?" Samuel considered the question with the deliberate thought process typical of those with this type of brain injury. Finally, he replied with simple dignity, "I never came home looking for parades, just a quiet place to remember my brothers, who didn't make it back. Now maybe I can remember them properly." Has someone from your past ever reappeared when you least expected it? Tell us about that moment of recognition. Sometimes they return in worn coats, their medals hidden in memory, waiting for the world to remember them too. 6 months after that fateful court appearance, Samuel Brooks moved into a small, tidy apartment in a veterans' supportive housing complex.
The walls, once bare, now displayed framed photographs and documents chronicling a life of service that had nearly been forgotten. Each morning, Samuel would sit at a small desk by the window, writing in a new leather-bound journal, a gift from Judge Carter. His doctors had suggested journaling as therapy, a way to externalize memories that might otherwise slip away. These writings, fragments of his wartime experiences and subsequent life, were being preserved in the National Veterans History Project archive. The bench outside the Chicago Public Library, where Samuel had once sat unnoticed, now bore a small bronze plaque in honor of Staff Sergeant Samuel T. Brooks and all veterans whose service must never be forgotten. Library staff had established a special veterans outreach program, ensuring that those who visited, whether seeking information or simply shelter, received appropriate resources and respect. The courtroom where Judge Carter had recognized her long-ago rescuer was similarly commemorated. Brooks's chamber, where justice boasts of courage. The space was now dedicated specifically to veterans' cases, with trained advocates present at all proceedings. Maya Delgado, the law student, whose research had helped uncover Samuel's identity, changed her career focus. After graduation, she joined the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, specializing in cases involving veterans with traumatic brain injuries. When orienting new interns, she would often tell Samuel's story: "We don't judge people, we judge our incomplete understanding of them." Judge Carter maintained regular contact with Samuel, joining him for coffee every other Sunday. Their conversations were often quiet, punctuated by the comfortable silences of people who understood that some bonds transcend words. Occasionally she would bring old photographs of Vietnam from historical archives, helping him piece together fragments of his past. On the anniversary of their courtroom reunion, local veterans organized a small ceremony honoring Samuel. When asked to speak, he approached the microphone hesitantly, his words carefully chosen and delivered with the deliberate pace of someone who has learned to navigate around missing memory. "A person's name," he said, looking out at the gathered faces, "is sometimes an entire history we haven't yet learned." The room fell silent, absorbing the profound truth in his simple statement. "Heroes aren't always found on pedestals," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sometimes they're sitting quietly in defendants' chairs, forgotten by the very world they help protect." Judge Carter, seated in the front row, nodded silently, tears glistening in her eyes. Samuel's final words that day resonated through the room with quiet power. "Listen before judging, for the silence of one who has endured may speak louder than any defense." These three philosophical reflections would later be engraved in bronze at the entrance to the Veterans Justice Center, established in his name. A reminder to all who entered that behind every name lies a story, behind every silence lies a sacrifice, and within every judgment should first come understanding. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up when you're doing what's right. What moment have you stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see that truth and justice ultimately prevail. Share this video with someone who needs faith in doing the right thing.